Shopping is hard, right? But there's a better way. Stitch Fix online personal styling makes it easy. I just give my stylist my size, style, and budget preferences. I order boxes when I want and how I want. No subscription required. And she sends just for me pieces. Plus outfit recommendations and styling tips. I keep what I love and send back the rest. It's so easy. Personal styling for everyone. Get started today at stitchfix.com/Spotify. That's stitchfix.com/Spotify.
Exclusively on ESPN Plus, UFC 312, Saturday. Reigning middleweight champion Dricus du Plessis defends his title in a rematch against Sean Strickland. And Zhang Wei Li defends her strawweight title against undefeated Tatiana Suarez. UFC 312, Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern. Buy it on ESPNplus.com/PPV.
Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. Every once in a while, I decide to celebrate the milestone anniversary of one of the greatest or most influential video games of all time. And we have a doozy for you this episode, as during today's main segment, we will be discussing Super Mario Bros. 3. Before we get into that, we have a bit of news to get to. Joining me for this episode is New York Post sports reporter, my former podcast co-host from another show that we used to do, and a very good friend of mine. It's Scott Fontana. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Brian. It's so great to speak with you again. We haven't really been in touch lately. They've been so busy, so to be able to connect like this is awesome.
Yeah, last time we saw each other was going to dinner with our families out in Pittsburgh. You happened to be on a road trip with your family, and I was visiting my folks who live out in Pennsylvania during the summer, so just like our timing coincided perfectly, and we went to a very nice Italian dinner.
It was great. And my kids got to play with dough. They gave them dough to play with, which was, at least it gives them something to do, not just eat.
Yeah. So, it was very nice to meet your family, because I've only ever met you, because it's like,
right.
Hey, I'm in, because you live by New York. So whenever I go to New York, you come over, or you try to come over and grab a quick bite to eat or something like that. And you're in the midst of your busy day. So it was nice to actually meet the family, the fam behind the man. And
likewise, I met your family too.
Yeah, it was a great get together, but it's nice to also have you on the show and catch up and talk about the various goings on in the world of Nintendo. Unfortunately, not a ton happening, and I've shared this concern as somebody who runs a weekly Nintendo podcast, that as soon as we got that Switch 2 reveal, it was like, all right, cool. April 2nd is when we're going to learn more. Oh God, what are they going to do between now and April 2nd? Is this just going to be me going into the mines and trying to find ways to fill episodes between now and then? Because that's like a lot of episodes to try and fill here. But, we've got some stuff to talk about today. And we had a Nintendo earnings call to wrap up fiscal year 2024, quarter 3, I believe it was. And, all we've been getting lately has been Switch 2. That's all the big news that we've been getting anyway. And Nintendo president Shuntaro Furukawa gave us a few talking points in the investor Q&A that was a part of the third quarter fiscal report. And Furukawa touched on certain things like how Nintendo is trying to ensure that the price of the Switch 2 will kind of walk this tightrope of keeping up with inflation and also the very different yen to US dollar exchange rate that exists now versus 2017 when the Switch 1 launched. But Furukawa also said that he's very aware that affordability is an important part of the Nintendo equation for a lot of folks. Scott, what are your predictions for not only the Switch 2 release date, but also the price?
So, I mean, just my 2 cents here. I feel like it's probably going to end up somewhere in like the $400 range. That's what I'm bracing for, at least. We can figure out if I can budget that in or not this year. My kids were asking me, they're like, are we getting a Switch 2 when it comes out? I'm like, we'll see. we got to wait and see. But I feel like we're probably looking at more like a fall situation, because that's typically the window, right? You're almost always looking at a fall release for the big consoles.
Yeah, we got a March release date for Switch 1, My prediction, I don't know if I've said it on this show or somebody else's show because I've done a lot of guest spots recently, but my prediction is it's going to be $400 and it's going to hit June 20th. And the reason for that is because there's a timeline that was established with Switch One where they revealed it in the the quick like video where it was like they were doing the rooftop parties and the guy was playing Breath of the Wild out in like the park with his dog and all those other things, playing, getting off the basketball court and playing NBA 2K immediately.
As everybody started doing afterward. I think we knew that was a big thing.
It really ground our economy to a halt because people couldn't stop playing NBA 2K on a real basketball court. Mm-hmm. But then a couple months later, and it's almost in lockstep with how much space there was between the Switch One reveal and the Switch One like big information blowout live stream and the Switch 2 reveal, and what we're expecting is going to be this big information blowout for Switch 2. And then on top of that, the timing of the consumer hands-on events are also in lockstep with the Switch 1's timing. So with that in mind, the Switch 1 big info live stream was January 2017. And then 2 months later, we got it in March 2017. So if that timing follows the way it has so far, you'll get that Switch live stream early April, and then early to mid-June, we would get the launch of the console.
That makes sense because I was actually at one of those hands-on things they had in New York for the Switch. Mm-hmm. I think it might have been in January. It's probably the one that you were referring to. Reggie was there and everything. It was definitely, it makes a lot of sense. Everything you're saying, I could totally see that being the lineup. June 20. What is that? A Tuesday?
That is a Friday.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I buy it. I
was thinking, all right, maybe we'll do the 13th because that's right after Summer Game Fest. And then I was like, you know what? I think they're going to want a little bit of space. And also, I don't know how superstitious Nintendo is as a company, but Friday the 13th might not be the play for them, especially since they're trying to obviously avoid all the pitfalls they made with the Wii U, with like the naming convention and trying to iterate or deviate from what was successful too much. So I think that maybe the 20th is the sweet spot there.
I've got two things for you. Number one, I'm pushing for maybe June 11, because that's my birthday, and that would be a nice, neat way to maybe make it easier for me to push it on. Hey, what if we just got this for me as a present? Like whether we can or can't afford it, we'll figure that out. But the fairy will get me some money. That's number one. Number two, this is the 40th anniversary of the Nintendo Entertainment System, correct? This is the 40th anniversary of the year?
In the U.S., yes.
What in the U.S.? Yeah. What date do you recall did it come out in the United States?
Do you happen to know this, or are you asking me?
I don't. I'm asking if you know, my Nintendo expert friend.
I want to say it was in the fall, but
that sounds right.
Oh, I took NES thinking it would bring up the obvious one. It brought up Nashville Electric Service.
What? No, that's the one we were thinking of, actually. Funny enough.
Let's see. Apparently, I can't type. I'm sorry. This is awful.
No, that's okay. Honestly, I'm really just ruminating on the Nashville Electric Service.
All right. So, according to Wikipedia, it was August 14th, Oh, wait, no, that's discontinued. October 18th, 1985. I don't think we're waiting until October if consumers are getting their hands on it.
Probably not.
I mean, maybe they'll do like some kind of like celebration collection, even though they already have the Nintendo Switch Online library. I don't know. We'll have to wait.
I'm curious if they're going to do anything around there. That'll be interesting.
So that was
my NES shirt and everything.
Hey, there you go. Yeah, and this is a milestone year for the NES. But meanwhile, on another earnings call, this time Electronic Arts earnings call, EA CEO Andrew Wilson said some very stupid things where he demonstrated he learned all the wrong lessons from Dragon Age the Veilguard underperforming. Basically says that like he would have had it would have done better as a live service game instead of a single player game. But outside of that, he did kind of hint that Madden and EA Sports FC might be coming to Switch 2. He was like, hey, like those franchises have traditionally done pretty well on Nintendo consoles. We didn't really support the Switch 1 with our sports franchises, so it'd be cool to have them come back. It's like the gist of it, a very a very casual paraphrasing of, a lot of business speak that was thrown out by Andrew Wilson. But back to the Nintendo earnings report, we also got an update to the sales number for the Switch and all of its best-selling games. So the Nintendo Switch has now sold nearly 151 million units worldwide, which puts it less than 4 million units away from being the highest-selling Nintendo system of all time. The Nintendo DS sits currently at 154.02 million units sold in its lifetime, so it's within striking distance of that. And the PlayStation 2, but this is a little bit of a bone that I have to pick with Sony right now. And I know you're a big Sony fan, Scott.
I am. I'm ready to go to bat for them.
For the longest time, the PlayStation 2's official sales number for its lifetime was 155 million units, making it the best-selling video game system of all time. Until last November, when Sony was like, oh, by the way, it's 160 million now. Like, this seems a little convenient that because a competitor's console was suddenly closing in on the all-time record, they're like, oh, by the way, there were actually 5 million units that we just found in our spreadsheets.
It doesn't feel to me so much convenient as it's petty. Because I feel like they probably knew that number and were like, it's not worth mentioning. Who cares? Now that it's a matter, it's like, well, actually, technically, you've got to beat this number.
Is that your Sony accountant voice?
That is how they all talk. I've met every one of them.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then I'm sorry for questioning.
No, that's okay.
Going over to the top 10 selling Switch games of all time, there was no shift in any of the order, so that the top 10 remained intact. But we got some updates to the numbers of those top 10 games. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe sold more than 3 million units in the last 3 months to reach nearly 67.5 million units sold. So one of the greatest selling Nintendo games of all time. I think Wii Sports is like one of the only ones that outsold it, and that's just because it was packed in with the Wii.
That's like a cheat, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a cheat code. Animal Crossing New Horizons is at 47.5 million units. Then it goes Smash Ultimate number 3, Breath of the Wild number 4, Mario Odyssey number 5, Pokemon Sword and Shield 6. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is closing the gap right on Sword and Shield's tail at number 7. Tears of the Kingdom number 8, Super Mario Party number 9, and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe at number 10. Scott, just to put these sales numbers into perspective, the top selling game on a console that I know you and I are very, very, very much in love with, the Nintendo 64. The top selling game of all time on Nintendo 64 was Super Mario 64. That sold less than 12 million copies. New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe is the 10th best-selling Switch game and has sold more than 18 million copies. So that's a more than 6 million unit gap between the 10th best-selling Switch game and the number 1 best-selling N64 game. And then on the GameCube, it's actually a bigger gap. So Smash Melee was that system's top-selling game, and it topped out at less than 7.5 million units. So there's more than 10 million units between the top-selling GameCube game and the 10th best-selling Switch game. And the only game on Super Nintendo that was best, that would be in the top 10 of all Switch games if it stacked all the sales together, would be Super Mario World. And that's largely thanks to it being a pack-in game. And then Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt, same story over on the NES. They would have beaten out the 10th best-selling Switch game of all time because they were pack-in games.
I have a theory, though. I have a theory, Brian, about why the numbers for a lot of the games, maybe not all of them, but a lot of these Switch games are just so much higher. Obviously, the console has reached a wider base, right? It's sold more units.
There's a lot more gamers now.
But there's more gamers. There's part of it, too, though, is the fact that I can talk about my own family in this case. We have 2 Switches in our house. My young son saved his money and bought himself a Switch Lite. I already had a Switch. I don't know why he bought it. He barely uses it compared to his tablet. So it's his own money. I don't care. But obviously now we're talking about the fact that there are multiple Switches in a home, whereas you didn't really have multiple, Super NES or N64, that kind of thing. And some of those games, maybe Mario Kart, if you got multiple systems, you might have multiple copies of the game too.
That's very true. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of all these things. And if we want to look at Super Mario Brothers 3, which we're going to be talking about later on in this episode, it only sold about the same amount as New Super Mario Brothers U Deluxe has sold on Switch so far, which, by the way, is a re-release of a Wii U game. And it is the 10th best-selling Switch game of all time. And, you know, Mario 3, one of the most iconic video games ever, only matched that of the 10th best-selling Switch game of all time. That's just, Nintendo's audience has grown so substantially, and there's all those different factors like what you pointed out, Scott, of like having multiple consoles in the same household, which, you know, I would say that tracks more with handhelds than it does consoles.
And that's where we've got that hybrid theory into there. And hybrid theory obviously is a different thing, right? We're talking about like a park at that point, but
yeah, there's so many different factors.
It's definitely a different thing. Yep.
Yeah, so it's hard to compare 1-to-1 because, like, then you could be like, oh, well, let's compare the best-selling DS games of all time, and it's like, okay, but what about, like, you know, other console-based factors? It's very difficult to do like the actual 1-to-1, but it's just wild to look at how successful the Switch and all of its games have proven to be.
Overwhelming success. I mean, all the kids that I know, again, I have young children, they're elementary age, and everybody has a Switch. Everybody plays their Switch. At this point, a lot of them are playing Fortnite as opposed to some of those games we already mentioned, but nonetheless, it's highly popular, even with the younger set.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a certain subsection of younger gamers in particular where it's like they buy a console, whether it's an Xbox, a PlayStation, or a Switch, and that's just their Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite machine. And that's just
exactly it.
So definitely that. But then, you know, there's people like you and me who buy probably way more games than we'll ever even get to play.
Accurate. Yeah. Highly accurate.
I have many, many games on my Switch. I just actually switched over to a new Switch because my launch model that I've been using since 2017, the battery just doesn't last. So I finally bit the bullet and just swapped over all of my save files and everything over to this new Switch. Turns out it's a pain to migrate to a new Switch because you can't just take your micro SD card and plug it into the new Switch because they make you reformat it. And it's like, oh, well, I guess all of my games are just deleted now. And thankfully, you know, cloud saves and everything allowed me to download a lot of the files. Did not let me download my Pokemon files because they don't support cloud saves on that.
Oh, jeez.
It's the dumbest thing because I guess they're worried about people duplicating Pokemon in that way, but it's like
probably because they will.
But
in fairness,
who cares? That's my counterpoint. Who cares?
Fact.
I'd rather have my save file and like just risk that. Oh, well, this person is going to have 6 Mewtwo's. I don't know. That's just me.
It is also obnoxious. Again, I can tell you just because we have 2 Switches now. It is obnoxious having 2 Switches because you have like a primary account and a secondary account. My son's is the secondary account. So anytime now that we open a game on either one, it wants to check if the other console has it open. And if you're not connected to the internet, it won't check, and thus you can't play.
Yeah, they have some stuff to figure out because the other thing is
them to do it.
When I went through and I was like, okay, well, I guess I have to go like through the eShop and re-download all of these games one by one. It maxes out at a certain thing because I just spent like, you know, probably like 20 minutes scrolling through my available to download list on my account. And it just took me so long because you have to hit it, the re-download button, and then it reloads the screen. And then you have to go down and then hit it again on the next game. And I didn't realize it capped out at like 25 games. So I was going through and doing it all the way down. And then it was just like, oh, it only like did it up because it was all alphabetical. It was like, oh, it only did it up to like the H's. And so I had to like wait for all those to download. And so, yeah, it's just Nintendo has some work to do on the eShop and online licenses, especially front.
Quality of life improvements is a key thing here. Stuff that they could do now, but they're not going to because we're going to maybe do it then.
Will hopefully be their excuse.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
And then, Scott, speaking of the Switch 2, we finally got an official announcement of exactly when the Switch 2 full reveal Nintendo Direct will be airing. We already knew it would be April 2nd, but Nintendo confirmed it will be April 2nd at 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. So mark that on your calendar as I have. Normally when we get these timing announcements, it's actually accompanied by like length of the show. They'll say, hey, tune in at this time for 40 minutes of new information regarding this. They didn't do that this time. So
block off your whole day.
Yeah, that basically I just put an hour. I was like, it's not going to be longer than like 2 hours. But if I see that, I'm just like, okay, I'm not going to schedule anything around that. But how are you feeling about this slow lead up to Switch 2?
I mean, I guess I'm used to it. I'm not surprised this is how the way they do things. A lot of consoles, it's always like a slow drip. We're going to have the reveal, and then we're going to have the deep dive. And then, Nintendo, obviously, they have their own special events that, Sony and Microsoft didn't necessarily do with their consoles. But at least when they have those, it feels like it continues to further build the momentum of that console. For the business, it makes a lot of sense. I get that. But I don't know. Sometimes I would almost be happier if they did the whole Sega Saturn thing. It was like, oh, it's available now, guys.
I've argued that was an incredibly stupid move by Sega. I mean, it's one of the when I talked to Tom Kalinske, who was the president of Sega of America back then, that was one of the reasons that he left. He was just like, that was kind of like one of the straws that broke the camel's back, was when they made me get up on that stage and say, here's the price, it's available now. Because he was like, I knew this was like the dumbest idea possible. And but like, it was a very dumb idea. And I think it would be a dumb idea today, but I think it would be less dumb today because like the internet just allows you to communicate instantly.
Yeah, I would argue actually that yes, absolutely. In 1995?
Yeah.
Highly dumb, supremely dumb. But for today, I don't know. I could see it work. We got Taylor Swift drops her album all of a sudden at midnight, and all these things happen, right?
But that's just a button that you download, right? Like an album is a button you just say, yeah, I'll log into Spotify or Apple Music or whatever you use, and I'll just download it and I'll listen to it within like 30 seconds of accessing that page.
Maybe give it a week then, you know what I mean? Something where it's like immediately like, get out of here. We're going to have it next week? Are you kidding? That would be pretty nuts.
I would be excited. It would also crash every retailer's servers across the planet.
That's true.
So I think they would not be super happy about that. But yeah, that's all the Switch 2 news that we got and all the Nintendo specific like news that came out of the earnings calls. Before we get to the rest, I just want to remind everyone that you can support the show by going to Patreon and searching for All Things Nintendo. There, for $5 a month, you can get early and ad-free episodes of the show, priority access to Q&A and interactive episodes, and access to the All Things Nintendo community Discord, where we talk everything from video games to TV shows and music, to even folks' thoughts on the latest episode of this show. All right, Scott, we have a couple of other smaller pieces to get to before we transition to the main segment. I'm pretty sure I remember that you are a fan of Capcom fighting games.
Generally speaking, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm more Street Fighter than I am any other fighting series.
Okay, well, earlier this week, Capcom held a Capcom Spotlight live stream on YouTube, and the entire second half was focused on Monster Hunter Wilds, which we're not going to really dig into because that's not coming to Switch. But we did, in the first half, get a more in-depth look at Capcom Fighting Collection 2. And that bundle includes 8 games, which is Capcom vs. SNK Millennium Fight 2000 Pro, Capcom vs. SNK 2 Mark of the Millennium 2001. The names are getting a little bit easier now. Capcom Fighting Evolution, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper, Project Justice, which is a sequel to Rival Schools. My 2 favorite games in this collection, Power Stone and Power Stone 2. And then a game I'm actually not familiar with whatsoever, Plasma Sword Nightmare of Bilstein. And they revealed some new information about this collection. All the titles will have rollback netcode for online play, training mode, adjustable difficulties, 1-button special options, quick save features so you can drop in, drop out, art gallery, sound gallery, and special challenges to complete. And on top of that, we got a release date. This bundle comes to Switch and every other major platform on May 16th. Does this sound like one that you will want to check out, Scott?
Me personally, no. I think I've more or less been made available all of the, let's say, throwback fighting games, retro fighting games that I was always interested in. All the Street Fighters, Darkstalkers was always fun. Big fan of that.
I think that's in the first Capcom Fighting collection.
It is. I have that one. Actually, it was on sale recently, and I got it.
Nice.
I haven't sunk my teeth in yet, but we'll get to that. And then, some Marvel vs. Capcom. That one moves like almost too fast for me. I'm just not quite good enough for that one. I
so much going on.
Yeah, exactly. Street Fighter's a little slower, so I like that one better.
Yeah. I am definitely picking this up just for Power Stone 1 and 2, especially online play with Power Stone 2. That is absurd. I don't know how it's going to work with like, I don't think all my friends who had Dreamcasts back in the day are going to like be able to fire up Power Stone 2 with me and play online. One, I haven't kept in touch with any of them, but two, I just don't think that that's going to be something that we're going to seek out, especially since I don't have Facebook anymore. So that makes it a little bit tougher. But yeah, Power Stone 1 and 2, I'm so excited they're bringing that back. I even told the Street Fighter 6 devs when I was out there in Osaka for the Street Fighter 6 cover story that we did at Game Informer. I told them, I was like, hey, I want you to bring back Power Stone. And they like, through an interpreter said, yeah, we want that too. So I would love if they could figure out like, oh, there's actually life to this franchise. And then we get some meaningful Power Stone follow-up. I would be so stoked for that.
I'd like to think that you had at least a small role in making this happen. So congratulations, you got what you wanted.
I will take credit for certain things, like the existence of Skyward Sword HD. Like when I asked Eiji Aonuma at E3 2019, could you ever do Skyward Sword without motion controls? And he like told me like, no, that would be close to impossible. And then like 2 years later, they put Skyward Sword HD on Switch. And I asked him during my interviews with Tears of the Kingdom, like, hey, you told me this back in 2019, and then a couple years later we got this. What changed? And he's like, oh, when you asked me that, at first I thought like, oh, that might be impossible, and then I got ideas in my head, and then I decided to do it.
Kudos to you. You have literally changed gaming.
And then there was another one that I completely forget what it was, but it was like, oh, I asked you this question, and that, but I have planted the seeds to both Yoshinori Kitase at Final Fantasy or at Square Enix for a Final Fantasy X remake, and then Eiji Aonuma for an Ocarina of Time remake. So if those come to fruition, I will be insufferable. But no,
no, that's good. I like that.
I just asked them basically like asking Santa Claus for Christmas, like, hey, here's what I want. And then like, hey, we'll see what happens.
That's true. Yes. So you can ask, but you're not necessarily just getting.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a lesson we all learned from all the mall Santas we visited as kids.
Yes.
But Scott, the final news segment that we will be talking about is not Super Mario Brothers 3, because that is what we're talking about in the main segment. But there is one 2D platformer that I actually prefer over that game, and it is the latest addition to the Nintendo Music app. Super Mario World was added to the Nintendo Music app, added 49 tracks from that game to the app, which is a free download on your phone's app store. But you do need to have a Nintendo Switch Online account and have an active subscription in order to use it. Scott, where does the Mario World soundtrack rank for you?
Extremely high, especially for that era of gaming. It's so iconic. I really truly love that one. I was very happy. I couldn't believe it took this long, because I did embrace the Nintendo Music app like right when it launched. I was like, oh, this is a great idea, and they had Donkey Kong. They added the Donkey Kong countries and that kind of thing, which was really great. I didn't think about it, but when it came, I was like, how is it not already here? I couldn't believe it. So that was really nice.
Yeah, it's like one of those features where it's like, oh, that, like, you have an Android phone, I have an iPhone. Every once in a while, Apple will come out and be like, hey, we're adding this incredible feature. And all the Android people are like, we've had that for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's kind of like that, where it's like the people who, because I've had the Mario World soundtrack on my phone for about 10 years now, thanks to Apple Music, where you can add your own music into your library, which is the only reason that I have that over Spotify, is because I like having my favorite game soundtracks. And, not a lot of, or I'll say, compared to back then, there are a lot of video game soundtracks on Apple Music. But back then, when I first when I was using iTunes on my iPhone and everything, there were not a lot of video game soundtracks. Like I think like Sega was like one of the main pioneers of getting their soundtracks up on these streaming services. And now it's pretty much the norm, but Nintendo just can't put it up on Spotify and Apple Music. They have to make it so you have a separate app. So you can't even like put it into playlists with other game music that you like. But I can. So
I will say though, and yeah, as you know, because I brought this up to you earlier today, I would love it if Nintendo would finally bite the bullet and add Android Auto compatibility or Apple CarPlay, because I want to be able to play it very easily through my car. My kids actually like listening to video game music.
Oh, that's great.
We've been playing Mega Man X in the car, and the kids are like, I'll turn it down, and they're like, can you turn it up? So I have to turn the music back up so they can listen to the awesome metal and rock of Storm Eagle and his stage. So I would love if we could just get that so I can plug it into my car and immediately listen to the delightful music from Super Mario World.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great songs on there. Scott, before we break, I do want to acknowledge that there have been some new releases for Switch, but sadly, I have not played Rift of the Necrodancer. I haven't played Civilization 7, and from what I understand, only PC review codes were sent out. And I can't really talk too much about Hello Kitty Island Adventure because I have played through it, but I actually played the Switch version several months ago as a consultant for the studio. So I would not feel comfortable talking about it because I actually, I don't want to say worked on the game, but I consulted with them on that game. And, it wouldn't feel right for me to levy criticism and praise for a game that, I actually did something for.
Yeah, so I would say that probably that tracks as far as ethical standards there. So good on you.
So yeah,
and I know it's killing you because I know you're a giant Hello Kitty fan.
Just the biggest Hello Kitty fan.
Yeah,
but I mean, I was looking forward to that game just because I liked Animal Crossing New Horizons, and this has a lot of the same mechanics. But if you're wondering why I'm not talking about these 3 new releases, or in Civilization 7's case, an upcoming release, those are the reasons why. I have not played the first 2, and then Hello Kitty, I just have decided I'm not going to really talk too much about it, aside from generalities, like I did with saying like it was like Animal Crossing New Horizons style of gameplay. So yeah, that's why those are not being mentioned here, and we're instead going to talk about Super Mario Brothers 3, which is why we're also not going to play Super Mario Brothers 3 or Super Mario World music going into the break. We're going to play Super Mario Brothers 3 music going into the break, and we are going to take that break right now, and when we return, we will be celebrating that game, which is one of the greatest video games of all time. We will be right back.
I see you looking at me.
Can I have your attention, please? Yes, hi, Wanda Sykes here. You ever think about all the nicknames we have for breasts? Boobs, tatas, the girls, chesticles, bubbies. Heck, you might even have your own nickname for them. And yet, even though they get so much attention, they're still so ignored when it matters most. What's up with that? Well, on February 9th, tune in to see why I'm talking so much about breasts and visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more.
We are back, and ever since I started All Things Nintendo, there's usually been an obvious topic to discuss, thanks in large part due to how successful the Switch has been, and, Nintendo's expansion out to movies, theme parks, Legos. There's always been a topic to talk about that has been obvious, but, this week, and I imagine many of the other weeks leading up to the Switch 2 reveal in April, are going to be pretty barren. And when that happens, the rare occasion that it has happened in the Switch's life cycle, I usually look at a bank of segment ideas, see if I can dip into the inbox for a Q&A episode, or look at my handy-dandy list of games celebrating milestone anniversaries. I'll be honest, this week I was racking my brain, wondering what episode I could possibly put together in this dry week, and then I opened up my list of anniversaries and I saw it. Super Mario Bros. 3, considered by most to be one of the greatest video games of all time, turns 35 years old here in the US next week. Before we get into the history of this game, Scott, do you remember your first experience with Super Mario Bros. 3?
I don't know if it was the first one, but I definitely remember going over and playing at a friend's house across the street. And we had to be quiet because his father was a policeman who worked the night shift. So he was sleeping in the house. He was asleep. But it was like, we had to play this thing. So we were always over at his house. We were playing the game. We never got very far. We weren't very good, at least in the beginning. And then what we would do is after a little while, maybe either we got too loud or we were just done, we'd go in the backyard and then we would act it out back there. Like we'd be trying to avoid boom booms and all this stuff. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I definitely had some moments like that. I think I had a friend whose either father or mother worked the night shift. So they were also we had to be very quiet because the parent who was working was sleeping. And, it's always difficult when you're a group of 3 or 4 young boys getting very excited about a new video game to keep it down. But yeah, my first experience, I believe, was going to my grandmother's house, my grandmother and grandfather's house, and their youngest son, who was only a few years older than me. I think he's like 8 years older than me. So he was still living at their house. I think he was like a senior in high school and I was like a little kid. And he had an NES and he had Contra and he had Super Mario Brothers 3. And I remember he let me play the games a little bit. And then I remember like he had beaten the game and there's like a moment where like you have to jump around like whatever holes Bowser had made in the ground, which is the final boss, and like you have to basically trick him into smashing through the ground to fall to his death. And I was like, oh, can I play? And my grandmother was like, hey, let Brian do this. And he's like, I beat the game. I can't have him die. And because like he's just gonna fall in the pit, and like all I have to do is get to that door. And my grandmother's like, no, let him do it. And he's like, no, but I just beat the game. So I did not die. To my credit, I did not fall in the pit. I got over, and then so my first experience, or one of my first experiences with Mario 3 was actually seeing the ending of it. But outside of that, I basically have the first level in Mario 3 like burned into my memory. Really every level in that first world burned into my memory. It's just, such an iconic game, such an incredible leap forward for the Mario franchise after Mario 1 and then the two versions of Mario 2 that we saw. So that's where we're going to start with this rundown of the history of Mario 3. So this was shortly after the release of the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2 in 1986. A team of 10 developers led by directors Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka began working on Super Mario Bros. 3. And I actually found an internal interview that Nintendo did. They used to do a lot of like Iwata Asks and everything. Unfortunately, this was, I believe, shortly after Satoru Iwata had passed away. This was in 2016 to coincide with the launch of the NES Classic Edition mini console. And this interview was Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, and Koji Kondo. So basically 3 of the most influential game developers of all time. And it was just like a Japanese reporter that worked for Nintendo, I believe, interviewing these 3 legends about like Mario 1 and Mario 3. And unfortunately, it was seemingly removed from Nintendo's website. So I had to access it through the Wayback Machine Internet Archive. So a lot of the quotes and like stories you're going to be hearing are coming from that interview, but there's also some other stuff. And I'll tell you when I'm pulling stuff from other sources as well. But to ensure that the best ideas could be shared freely, Miyamoto actually worked very closely with the designers and programmers from even the earliest stages, and then encouraged just pretty much uninhibited ideation so that the game would have original and exciting ideas, which Miyamoto says is like one of the most important factors in a video game's success, which, Scott, I know you've played a lot of Shigeru Miyamoto games and a lot of Nintendo games in general. I think that tracks for like all of Nintendo's history up to this point.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, you look at like some of the crazy ideas that were starting to come out of this game as opposed to the first Mario especially, right? Because Mario 2, as we know in the United States, was a very different game, and it was literally a different game that they just reskinned, basically, right? But in the case of Super Mario Brothers 3, like all sorts of wackiness. Like, oh, you can jump around in a boot. You can have a frog suit. You can be a tanuki, which is something that we in America did not know was, all sorts of wackiness. It was like when you say like, oh yeah, like any sort of ideation, it's like, it literally seems like some guys were just like, what if you were in a boot? And they're like, do it. Get it in.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the wildest idea was something that didn't even make it into the final game. And, originally, they were going to have the game play from an isometric view, and Miyamoto actually was the one that killed that idea. He chimed in saying that it was too hard to make precise platforming work with that view, so they moved it back to the 2D side scroller, like the previous 2 entries in the series. But then Miyamoto goes on to point out there are some relics from this period in development in the final game. If you look at like kind of the opening title screen, and the curtain goes up and you see Mario and Luigi kind of throwing shells back and forth at each other. There's a checkerboard floor on the ground, and that is a relic of the isometric view because they tried doing a checkerboard pattern in order to make it so you could choose like where you were going to jump and be like able to more easily spot where your character was going to land.
That's interesting because that opening is so iconic with the checkerboard, with the curtain and everything like that. So I never knew the history behind that. Good find.
So back when I interviewed Takashi Tezuka for Game Informer in 2015, he told me, quote, Super Mario Bros. 3 was all about us challenging ourselves to create a completely different play experience from previous Mario games. But it certainly wasn't an easy development process. After a long period of trial and error, we wound up settling on a game that retained what made the previous games good and added a lot of new elements to it. It was a completely different way of gauging gameplay from what we do today. So that desire that he's talking about to make something different is why Tezuka was actually one of the people that was interested in that isometric view initially. And then that idea was shot down by Miyamoto. So Tezuka was like, all right, well, how else can we make this game look and feel completely different from Mario 1 and 2, especially since in Japan, those two games look nearly identical. Like Mario Lost Levels is what we call it here, but it's just called Super Mario Brothers 2 over in Japan. The Super Mario Brothers 2 that we got, as most people know now, is an adaptation of Doki Doki Panic, which is another game in Japan. So the fact that Mario 1 and 2 look nearly identical, just a few different elements and obviously different levels, made Tezuka in particular want to make something completely different from that while still retaining all the things that made those games good in the first place. So that was a challenge for the team, and Miyamoto actually thought the game should be more welcoming to players since Mario 2 was so brutally difficult in Japan. And to keep the difficulty balanced, the team decided to load players up on power-ups, extra lives, coins, all those things in the early levels, and then slowly taper off to allow more skilled players to push through to the end. So that would allow like anybody to really pick it up and have a good time. And like, say they only play the first 2 or 3 lands, then, that they got a good time out of that and they don't really need to go any further. And, they're probably happy with what they played. I know that's how I was when I was a little kid. I would only play like the first several levels of most games. And it was rare that I would actually push through to the end because I was like, oh, I'm just having a really fun time with these early levels. But then if you like crave more, you keep pushing it and put your skills to the test. And then, the extra lives and the power-ups become a little bit more scarce.
And it's funny to think of that too, because if you, today, if you were to sit down and play Super Mario Brothers 3, and let's say you skip all the warp whistles, any of that too, you just want to play every world, you could still probably beat that in a day, like pretty easily. It wouldn't be 2 or 3 hours, probably more like 4 or 5, 6 hours or something like that. But now we've got games that are like 14 hours. It's like, well, this is way too short. I need a game that's 35 to 40 hours. And we were still good with just the first couple levels.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you bring that up because in that interview, Miyamoto and Tezuka were like, yeah, we kept hearing that people were like, this game was long, so they would have to play in multiple sessions. So they were leaving their console on like overnight and into the next day, and sometimes over a weekend or something if they were away, just so they didn't have to start over. And they were upset that there was no way to like save your progress. So that was one of the key inspirations that they brought into Mario World. And that's why Mario World has a save file, because I kept hearing these stories about, either people leaving their consoles on for days on end so they could beat the game, or the dreaded, my parents unplugged my console or turned it off while I was playing through the game and I lost all my progress.
The only time I ever left my console on overnight was I had my cousin over for a sleepover, and we were trying to beat Rampage, the NES port of it, I guess. And we got like halfway, and we're like, well, we can't beat this tonight. So very secretly, we left it on. We turned the TV off, and we put a pillow in front of the light so that no one could tell it was on. So my parents didn't like shut it off or anything. Of course, we didn't think to just ask. That was not like a thing we would even try to do.
I'm sure that the pillow was great for any kind of ventilation that the Nintendo needed.
Well, not in the front. It doesn't need a vent in the front. It was fine in the back. Who cares? Also, I was a kid. I did not know that was a thing.
So in addition to those changes that Miyamoto and Tezuka wanted to implement, they also worked on ways to add a ton of new enemies and bosses to the game. And I found an article from 1990. It was a Making of Mario 3 article from Nintendo Power in 1990. And Miyamoto talked about how Chain Chomp, which is the the kind of the black ball with teeth and eyes on the end of a chain, it was inspired by an early life experience that Miyamoto had where he was a younger person and a dog on the streets actually lunged at him, but the owner yanked on the leash to stop him from like reaching him and like biting him or whatever the dog was going to do. And that was an
Probably just
inspiration.
lick him and give him a kiss.
Yeah, because dogs are perfect, right? So in order to differentiate the game even further, Tezuka wanted to completely overhaul the look of the graphics. So the team enhanced the graphics in all kinds of ways. It looks like a completely different game, including adding an overworld map as a means of level selection. And then, meanwhile, Tezuka specifically focused on the Mario sprite, and the things he wanted to focus on were giving him more space between the hat and his eyes. And then Miyamoto points out that, like, in Mario 1 and 2, Japan, Mario 2, Mario's eyes are actually connected to his hat in the sprite. And by giving just a little bit of separation between the hat and the eyes, Miyamoto said, oh, he actually looks way cuter now as a character. So he liked that. And then Tezuka wanted to give him more personality and more defined features. So one of the things that he did was he made it so his Mario's eyes were actually separate entities, like there was a pixel between them. So those were just ways that they iterated on the Mario sprite.
I'm glad you were talking about the sprites too, because so right before I hopped on with you for this this appearance on your show, I said, well, it's been a while since I played it. Let me at least hop on a little bit. My younger son is homesick from school today, and I said, you know what? Why don't I show him that game, which he's seen before? But I was like, let's pop it in, and I'm playing it, and because I was playing it through the Nintendo Switch Online shop, it's pixel perfect, so there's no like settings of it being trying to mimic CRT or anything like that. So I'm looking at it, I'm like, my goodness, the pixels are just fantastic. The sprites and everything in this game are so much better today than they looked back then. Because when the kings would turn into dogs, I didn't know what the heck that thing was supposed to be when I was a kid. He's sitting on the throne, he's itching himself. I'm like, what is he doing? Is he barking? No one knew what they did. Did you know what they were when you were a kid? Could you really tell that was like an itching dog?
I think a lot of them I knew. I can't picture the dog in my head right now, but yeah, a lot of them I think I knew. It's like, okay, well, there's one that's like he's a spider. There's one that he's like a snake, I think.
This is a game that benefits, I think, from that, because you can see how beautiful these sprites are. Some games, it's like, oh man, it kind of robs the look of the old school TVs. This one, I think, benefits really well because the sprites really are fantastic. You're right.
For sure, yeah, it's a beautiful game. And the way that they accomplished making the game look so good and having all these different graphical enhancements was they used a new graphics machine that could better manipulate and generate shapes using the sprite system. And then the cartridge also used a special chip to allow for things like animated tiles and diagonal scrolling, which was something that was not available in the original Mario game. And Tezuka also brainstormed ideas for new actions that Mario could do. And he wanted Mario to fly. Like, this was a thing that Tezuka wanted Mario to be able to do, even in the first Super Mario Brothers. Like, one of the earliest ideas that Tezuka had when he was just like sketching Mario for the original Super Mario Brothers was Mario in a cloud, riding around the cloud, and then shooting fireballs at coins. So that was one of like the ideas of like, oh, what could we have this character do that would be like fun for players? And they just couldn't figure that out in Mario 1 to like have him fly. So like they ditched that idea. So he was like, all right, well, how do we give him a transformation that gives him like, similar powers as like the Fire Flower had in the first two games, and also enable him to fly? And he landed on a raccoon tail, which was a bit strange since raccoons famously do not fly. And they asked him this.
Generally speaking, yeah.
They asked him, Tezuka, this on the Nintendo interview, and they said the tail was decided because he wanted Mario to be able to spin around and knock enemies out of the way. And originally, when it was in the isometric perspective, the tail Mario would spin, and it would cause enemies to be blown away instead of actually like having to hit them. And when it switched from the isometric view to side-scrolling, it just didn't translate properly. So they switched it to be like a melee-style spin attack, and then they added the ability to fly because of his like long-awaited desire to make Mario fly in a game. Mm-hmm. So Tezuka had a quote in that Nintendo interview, said, A tail seems a bit forced, so I really worried over that. I kept wondering if Mario and a raccoon was the right match, which was kind of funny that even today he's just like, yeah, I was really worried that a raccoon was like a really like strange thing to like give Mario just like this random raccoon tail.
What if he was right that it was strange, but we just kind of accepted it because it was fun?
Yeah, I mean, and that's ultimately what Nintendo has always relied on with all of their game design. It's like, yeah, this is really weird, but that may be a good thing. And also, if it's fun, who cares?
Mm-hmm. I mean, even console design, it's literally like their whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's served them well for more than the past 40 years. So
I'd like to think that if they were still like a playing card company, they would have found a way to do something weird with that too.
I'm sure they would have. I mean, they had amiibo cards for Animal Crossing, so they definitely did not give that up, even though video games became their bread and butter.
It's true.
So they cracked the code on Raccoon Mario, and then they started experimenting with other power-ups. Like, okay, well, we have the Fire Flower, we have the Super Mushroom, we have this the leaf that turns you into a Raccoon Mario. What about these other ideas? So they started like thinking like, okay, well, what about like how can we make a water level feel better? And that's where Frog Mario was born out of. And then I don't know where this came from, but Mario inside of a Goomba shoe was like one of the defining power-ups for Mario 3. And that was just like the result of their kind of like unhinged, unhindered ideation that Miyamoto had been encouraging since the very beginning of development when it was just 10 developers. And, you know, around this time, Miyamoto joined in on the discussions because he liked these ideas so much. But the team came to him and were like, hey, we have all these great ideas for power-ups, for level designs. How are we going to pull this all together? And Miyamoto kind of came in and helped keep the team together and like have kind of like that top end vision, like top down vision is what I should say. And so the team kept iterating, and even with the extremely long development cycle for the time, which was 2 years, they still needed more time. The original release window for Japan was spring 1988, but they had to push it to October 1988, meaning that the development ended up taking 2.5 years, which was absolutely unheard of in that era. This is one of the biggest development projects of that time, or of the industry in general up until that point, which, you know, nowadays 2.5 years is like, you know, probably below average in terms of how long a game takes to create.
A top level game for sure. Yeah.
So by the time development had wrapped up, between 20 and 30 developers had touched and worked on the game. And in that Nintendo interview, Miyamoto recalled a map. It was called a map room, where they had like a repurposed meeting room where all the programmers would translate what Miyamoto, Tezuka, and other level designers had drawn on paper, and they would take those designs that they had drawn on the graph paper and they translated them into the computers. So they were actually programming the paper designs into the real level designs. And according to that Nintendo Power article that I found from 1990, Miyamoto actually based the Koopalings' looks and personalities loosely on 7 of the programmers as a means to thank them for their hard work on Super Mario Bros. 3. And when Nintendo of America got a hold of it, they localized them to base their names off of famous musicians, which is a very well-known fact. Some of the musicians they base their names off of are like Iggy Pop, Lemmy Kilmister, Ludwig von Beethoven, and Roy Orbison. And there's some other ones that I'm not mentioning.
I don't think I knew that was Roy Orbison. I knew those others, though.
Yeah, and he even has the glasses.
Yes,
Roy Orbison has the glasses. Roy, the Koopaling Roy, has the glasses that Roy Orbison was very famous for wearing. Koji Kondo, iconic composer, really the John Williams of video games. He was the sole designer and composer sole sound designer and composer of the game. And he said that he really struggled with the ground theme of Mario 3 because he couldn't figure out how to differentiate it from the ground theme of the original Super Mario Brothers. And in that Nintendo internal interview, he said, quote, "When I made the original Super Mario Brothers music, I didn't pay any attention to genre. Instead, I played the game and made the music that went along with it. But as more people heard it, they started saying it sounded Latin or like Latin fusion. And I wondered what direction to take with Super Mario Bros. 3. People even guessed that it was going to be reggae." And then he laughs. And then he says, "Having to think about the genre first led to all sorts of difficulty. So I made 2 ground themes, and just before completion, I had these these two, pointing to Miyamoto and Tezuka, listened to them, and I asked them which we should use. Working on the music for Super Mario Bros. 3 was quite a challenge. And I mean, hey, you can't argue with the results. It ended up being an extremely catchy soundtrack. You know, you can still hear the athletic theme every time you close your eyes. If you think hard enough about it, the ground theme is very iconic as well. I know you can hear the airship theme at any given point in the day. Are there any other songs that stick out in your head as like the ones that are like probably the ones that come to mind very easily for you?
I mean, you can even go to some of like the less known ones, like when you're playing the mini games, and it's like,
oh my god,
yeah, it's
the boss
everything
encounter
about it,
or the mini boss encounter.
Yeah. That's those first few notes there are also just like, yeah. And like I said, we used to play in the backyard, and we would go against Boom Boom. I'm sure we were probably doing the music out loud too.
Oh, absolutely. And Koji Kondo also said that the sound is so much better in Mario 3 versus Mario 1 and 2 because the cartridge technology advancements had really like just blown away the early cartridges of the NES. And Miyamoto and Tezuka also say that the vast leaps in cartridge technology are largely why the NES was so popular for so long and why they didn't have to upgrade to the Super Famicom or the Super NES sooner, because they were able to keep improving. We've seen that in other consoles as well. Like look at PS3 launch titles versus like something like the first Last of Us on PS3. It's just like a huge leap in how well developers had been able to really harness the technology that those consoles were using. So, I mean, it checks out that would be something that they'd be like, oh, we thought we were like, you know, this was all the power we were ever going to get out of this console. Because, you know, they're one of the first consoles to really hit it big. Like, obviously, the Atari 2600 was before that. But, like, you know, in terms of advancing technology and really pushing technology to the limits, the NES was one of the first ones to do it. So they were like, wait, we can actually squeeze more power out of this than we once thought? Like, that was probably a huge revelation for them.
Absolutely. And while we're still on the music, I'm going to give you, this is a little bit of an offshoot here, right? Because as you know, a lot of these games would make, you know, different promotional material, right? So there was like coloring books. I had a Super Mario Bros. 3 coloring book. And there was the TV series, The Adventures of Super Mario Brothers. So I believe Super Mario Bros. 3 is what they called it.
Yep, 26 episodes.
There was a musical guest in one of the early episodes. Do you know who that real life musical guest was?
Oh man, I feel like I did know this at one point, but I no, tell me.
Milli Vanilli.
I do remember that.
Which is in and of itself so bizarre because of everything else about Milli Vanilli. But yeah, that for whatever reason, that episode and whatever they called, because they changed the names of the Koopalings in the show from what they were in the games. And I don't remember what they called the daughter in the show. She might have been like
it was like Sweetie or so. Yeah, Cutie Pie, I think might be it.
It was like something like that. But I just in my head I can picture her screaming, "Milli Vanilli!"
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, we are not going to have Milli Vanilli on this podcast, unfortunately.
Funny enough, they're actually behind this door. they were doing some installs of stuff.
I mean, yeah, after their career tanked, I guess.
Oh, actually, I believe one of them or two of them might have passed away. But anyway.
Oh, well, unfortunately. Darn, I was hoping to have them on next week. Super Mario Bros. 3 came out in Japan on October 23rd, 1988. And they actually planned to bring it to the US sooner, but unfortunately a big chip shortage caused both Mario 3 and Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, to be delayed in the US. And as a result, Super Mario Bros. 3 didn't arrive in the US until 1990. So almost a year and a half delay there. To help promote the game in the US, Nintendo inked a deal with Universal Studios to promote both Super Mario Bros. 3 and the NES Power Glove in a movie called The Wizard. And Scott, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but in the climax of the movie, which revolves around a young boy played by Fred Savage entering a video game competition ahead of its time. Video game competitions are everywhere now, but back then it was kind of a novel concept. He's on a road trip to get to a video game competition, and in the climax, they surprise the characters in the game by saying, hey, the finale of this competition is Super Mario Brothers 3, which the game was only out in Japan at that point, and trailers weren't nearly as readily available as they are today. So this was one of the only chances for people to see this big of a look at the game before Mario 3 would come to the US a few months later. And I remember people talking about this like, oh my God, like Mario 3 is like up on the silver screen. Like people are playing, like Fred Savage, the boy from Wonder Years, is up on the movie screen playing a new Nintendo game that's not out yet. And it's a new Mario game. So like that was a huge deal. And then Nintendo also had a huge marketing budget for Mario 3 outside of that, and very iconic commercials if you go back and look.
I don't remember the Wiz. I remember that it exists, but I don't think I ever saw it.
I didn't see it in theaters. I was too young to see it then, but like I do remember like the cultural zeitgeist of like there's a Mario 3 like movie basically, even though it's only for like a few minutes at the end. It's like, you know, the actual story is centered around Fred Savage's character getting to the competition, and the Power Glove, it has the line, "It's so bad, it's good," or something.
I might have to go find that.
It's something like that. Oh, I love I need to find the actual quote, but yeah, the Power Glove.
Oh, I just mean the movie. I might have to watch the movie.
Let's see. I love the Power Glove. It's so bad, says the antagonist of the movie as he's wearing the Power Glove that, you know, is notoriously a bad peripheral because it just didn't work a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So Mario 3 finally arrives in the US February 12th, 1990. And wouldn't you know it, received universal acclaim, sold more than 250,000 copies in its first 2 days, and went on to sell more than 18 million units on the NES, plus millions of copies through the various virtual consoles that it has appeared on over the past several generations. And the game would inspire nearly all subsequent entries of the Mario franchise, whether you were talking about the overworld map, the ability to fly, or even just how Mario and Bowser look. What do you consider to be the most influential part of this game, Scott?
I mean, it probably is the overworld map. I think that really did change the way we think of it, because just about every Mario game from then on had some form of an overworld map. Super Mario World reinforced that, and I love that world better because it was so interconnected and everything, as opposed to you're just like, you're here and now you're over here. But yeah, I think that's the thing that really did change things. You got to see, okay, there's this level and there's this level and there's this level. You could even take different paths if you wanted to go to 3 or maybe skip to 4. You could do that. You could skip a whole world, or excuse me, this whole level from the world and move on.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many cool ways that you can manipulate the overworld map as well. Like the warp whistle, you can get away, like just go to a different land. And then like you said, skip levels and do different things to make it so that the world can kind of like, you have a little bit of player choice in how you progress through the world. And that was only hammered home further in Mario World.
Sure. Obviously, in the original Super Mario Brothers, you could get to those warp pipes and that kind of thing, but this took it to a whole different level.
Yeah, and it was fully linear in Mario 3, whereas this, there were ways you could play levels slightly out of order, or skip full levels entirely, but you would get rewarded for going in, getting like, you know, if I beat that extra level, I can go to the Toad House and play the kind of not slot machine game, but like the match game that you have to play, or whatever other mini games they had, or there's just going to be like a treasure
always
chest.
Feel like a fool that you cannot put 3 together. Like I tried to do it before, like I said when I was playing, couldn't do it. I got 2 out of 3 mushrooms and it was topped off by a fire flower.
And it does the boom boom, the really like just somber like you failed sound.
The one that's actually this one, I was like, what the heck? How is this still a thing? Or how was this even a thing? When you'd go to the ones that was the match house, you get 2 chances.
Yeah.
2 chances, and that is it. So you're just blind guessing and hoping you got something right.
Well, the good news was that always carried over into the next ones. So
it did. That was true. But if you'd have to sit there and like remember it from like, oh, what did I do an hour ago?
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, that was a little rough. So Super Mario Brothers 3, it's always included in these lists that outlets do celebrating the greatest games of all time. But we're just going to look at what Game Informer did. Game Informer, every 100 issues, I almost said 100 episodes, they used to do the top whatever 100 they were on games of all time. So 2001 for issue 100, they did the top 100 games. 2009 for issue 200, top 200, and then so on for 300 in 2018. So in 2001, top 100 games of all time, they did Super Mario Bros. 3 at number 8 of all time. In 2009, for top 200 games of all time, it was number 9. And then finally, in 2018, it jumped all the way up to second best game of all time. Do you want to guess what the number 1 game was that we put together for that issue?
Oh, goodness. And this is for NES, right?
This is for all games ever.
All games. Oh, goodness. That's a
But
great
this
one.
it considers legacy. It considers how good it is to play. It considers all kinds of stuff.
I'm going to appeal to your ego here, and I'm going to say Ocarina of Time.
No, I think that was in the top 10 or 15, though.
Okay.
This was another Zelda game, though, A Link to the Past.
Okay. All right.
I mean, you have to consider how influential that was as well. Like, turns out Nintendo has made some impact on the video game industry.
That's the rumor.
Yeah. So where does Super Mario Bros. 3 rank for you in terms of the best games of all time?
Best games of all time. I mean, it's certainly high, but I tend to not even put it as the top 2D Mario game because I'm much more an unabashed Super Mario World fan. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I'm not sure exactly where I would slot it, but I feel like it definitely makes the top 25 easy. I just don't know where. It could be even higher. It could be top 15 for all I know.
Top 25 games of all time overall.
Could be, yeah.
I just did my top 50 games of all time for my personal standpoint. Let me see what I did.
I'd have to sit down and ruminate on a whole list, probably for like several days. But I feel like top 25 sounds fair.
I put it at number 33 for just my personal games that I enjoy the most in my life.
Yeah, I would actually put it lower because there's games that I will put in different spots because I just like them better, right?
Yeah.
But if we're going with the best and most influential, it does feel like there were elements of that you've got to account for and give it its due, even if it wasn't yours, you know?
Yeah, if you're factoring influence into it, it's way higher than 33 because like if you're factoring influence, the number 32 on my list was Turtles in Time, which as much as I love Turtles in Time, it's not more influential than Super Mario Bros. 3.
It is not, but it's also criminally low on your list if it's only 32.
Hey, man, there's a lot of video games. But what about overall, just like platformers in general? Where does Mario 3 rank?
Oh, man, that's definitely really high. That's got to be top 10 easy. I mean, maybe top 5. But again, it's tough because how many of these are going to be Mario games? You know, like how many do we include all the Marios? Do we say, okay, if we're just picking one from each franchise, where to go? I feel like it's definitely top 10, but there's a lot of great platformers, even more modern ones. Like I'm playing Astrobot now with my kids, and that's a fantastic game. Where does that slot? I don't know. I'm very early, so I have no opinion yet. Don't hold me to be like, I can't believe you put it in your top 10. Didn't do it.
Well, oh man, it's so hard because Mario 3, it almost brings me back this conversation where you're like, oh, well, do you just choose like one representative from each franchise? These were conversations we had at Game Informer all the time. I remember writing the top 10 superhero games of all time. And when I put together my draft list, the entire top 5 was taken up by 2 franchises. It was Batman Arkham and Spider-Man, just kind of like going back and forth. Insomniac Spider-Man games, just going back and forth between those 2 franchises. Like, okay, well, like Arkham City's number 1, and then like Marvel Spider-Man is number 2, and then like Arkham Asylum is number 3, and then Spider-Man Miles Morales is it's just back and forth like that the whole time. And somebody was like, should we just like, limit this to one thing per franchise? And I believe it was our most recent editor-in-chief, Matt Miller, who said, I think that I like it better with all of the games represented here, like individually, because it speaks to how far ahead these 2 franchises are from the rest of the field.
I think I lean the other way personally, only because I want to be able to get in things like, what about Injustice 2? I feel like that's a game that we don't talk about enough about how fantastic of a fighting game that is within the entire, specifically a superhero game. And yes, it's wonderful. And I love all the Arkham games, right? Like, I'm even a big fan of Arkham Origins, which is the one that kind of gets a little bit of redheaded stepchild, unfortunate kind of treatment, right? But I think it's a solid game. I think you gotta sometimes be like, okay, with those ones in particular, because they can be very similar. Mario's different, right? Because Mario has had so many different evolutions and iterations and that kind of thing. You've got 3D Mario, you've got 2D Mario. Even within 3D Mario, you've got different things. So that one, it gets tricky, right? But yeah, I mean, who knows? There's no perfect way.
I'm not going to have you sit here and put together your top 10 platformers of all time live on the air, but ballpark estimate, if you put together your top 10 platformers of all time, just gut reaction, how many of those top 10 do you think are Mario games?
I'm going to ballpark it at like 4.
Wow, I was thinking 6 for me.
It's probably closer to that, but I kind of start there. I was like, gee, I don't know. What should we do here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably where I would land, is like 6 is probably Mario games.
It might be.
It's amazing how great this franchise has been for so long. And Mario 3 was really a turning point that really pushed it forward in a lot of ways and really installed a lot of the conventions that we still have in the franchise to this day. And if you want to play Super Mario Bros. 3 on your Switch, there are actually 3 versions available through your Nintendo Switch Online subscription. There's the original NES version in the NES catalog. The remade SNES version is included in Super Mario All-Stars, which is very fun to play. Like, it's like one of the earliest examples of a full-on remake of a classic game. Now we get them all the time, but
All-Stars is fantastic.
It is. Basically
so
just
good.
the original Mario games in Super Mario World graphics. It's incredible. And also, Mario World music style, like 16-bit style of music. Just modern for the time remakes of all of that stuff. It's amazing. But the one that I want to shout out in particular with a little bit of extra detail is the Game Boy Advance version, which actually adds extra levels that were previously only available through the e-reader peripheral on Game Boy Advance. That peripheral has long been, relegated to a failure, like a peripheral that like nobody picked up really. But in Nintendo Switch Online's Game Boy Advance catalog, they have all of those levels available just natively in the game. So it's Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Brothers 3, the dumbest name of all time. But the e-reader levels in Mario Advance 4 actually do some really cool things. Scott, have you ever looked into these e-readers, the e-reader levels?
No, I didn't even know it was a thing. You just blew my mind now because I'm like, I might go check that out after.
So the first few are just straight up Mario 3 remakes of Mario 1 levels, like 1-1, 1-2, and then, the first castle. So that's kind of like a cool, like, okay, we're doing some fun, like, crossover stuff. Then they just start making levels that cross over different mechanics from different games. Like, one has, like, the ability to pull veggies out of the ground, like in Mario 2 USA. There's enemies from Super Mario World plugged into this. Like, there's the Wiggler and the Charge and Chuck. There's the Galoombas that, like, parachute down. And then the poison mushrooms from Mario 2 Japan are in some of the levels. And then there are other levels that include level elements from other games. Like there's one where you're like, in Mario 2 USA, there's like that sand level where you have to do like the digging motion to descend in the level. There's one like that in Mario 3 Advance. Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Brothers 3. Very confusing. The diagonal wall run blocks that allow you to like run up on the wall in Mario World are in some of the levels. And there's even some levels that have the Mario World cape retroactively added into Super Mario Brothers 3. So definitely check that out. I don't know how many e-reader levels are. I want to say there's something like God, let me just look this up.
And while you do that too, I think you're actually shorting the number of Super Mario Brothers 3 versions you can play on Switch Online. There is the fourth one it's like the enhanced version.
Oh, right.
For the NES. Because I saw when I was looking through my catalog to play it today, I was like, "Oh, should I play that one or play?" I played the original, but I don't even know what that one does. So I was like, maybe I should check it out.
So the Game Boy Advance version of Mario 3 has 38 additional levels.
Okay, wow.
And it does all that cool stuff of like, plugging in different elements from different games. So like, there's a level. It's like you're playing Mario 3. But there are Mario 2 like veggies to throw at. So like you can throw the veggies like in Mario 2 at the Charge and Chuck from Mario World in a Mario 3 level. Like, it's very cool, kind of like brain breaking, as long as you don't mind the fact that in these Mario Advance games, the characters just do not shut up. Like, they have the voice acting added in.
Oh.
And every time Mario throws, he does the woo, woohoo. And it's just like, oh my God, shut up, dude. Like, play it cool.
We'll see how I feel about that. Yeah. I mean, look, there's a mute button. I can turn the sound down on my TV or on my Switch or whatever I want.
That's very true. But Scott, any closing thoughts on Mario 3 before we take our last break of this episode?
No, just the fact that it definitely was the definitive Mario Brothers experience available on the NES. And it was just so cool that when you look at the first Mario game, which really wasn't that long before, but again, what, 5 years, but really like 3 or 4 in Japan, the evolution that it took in the sprites and the way the game looks. Mario 1 is not the prettiest game. It just isn't. But Mario 3 is gorgeous. And again, I think it really comes across even more when you're able to play it on a pixel perfect television and see the sprite work in much greater detail. It's just, they did a great job with it. And it's one of those games that it has endured in a way that not every game does,
Very true. We are going to take our final break of this episode. And when we get back, we're going to do definitive ranking and get Scott's eShop gem of the week. We will be right back. We are back, and it's time for Definitive Ranking, a recurring segment where we take a Nintendo topic and give our own personal top 5 lists. Since we talked about one of the greatest NES games of all time this episode, Scott, I want to get your top 5 NES games of all time. So start at 5, count it down to 1, give me a sentence or two about each.
So this is a mix of between what I think are the best and what I just have some great memories of, because the NES was a part of my younger childhood, right? A lot of my opinions are probably not very good, because what did you know when you were 7 years old? Not a whole lot. We're going to start at number 5 with Blades of Steel. Blades of Steel.
Yeah, that's another sound that's just burned in my memory.
Hard game. If you go back and play it now, still hard, I think, personally. But it was a lot of fun. I loved just bumping into like my cousin, who was a big hockey fan. They were all hockey fans in that house. And we would just bump into each other, so we'd go fight. And then we'd just punch each other until someone fell down. I love that they had the team cities, but it wasn't officially licensed, which was not a term I knew when I was a child. And so they had, sometimes the colors looked about right. Sometimes they didn't. Like New York looked like the Rangers, but I didn't know that the Kings at that period of time were not black and silver, but I guess they were blue and yellow, things like that. But that game in particular was, that I have a lot of great memories of playing that one. That was like my first, and I'm not even a hockey fan, that was my first like sports game that I was all about.
Yeah, that's a good one. I didn't even think about that one while I was putting together my list, so I'm glad you called that out.
What do you got? What's your 5?
You go first. I
go through. All right.
You go through the entire list.
Number 4, Bubble Bobble.
I almost put that one on my list, and I was like, no, there's too many other good ones. And so you are giving like basically my honorable mentions right now.
I like that. I like that. So yeah, Bubble Bobble, again, another one that I had a lot of great memories playing at my cousin's house first, and then I eventually got it myself. But the music from that game definitely drilled in your head. I think there's only one ditty for the entirety of the game, but it's a good one. It's an earworm. I definitely liked that game because it felt like one of those. It was like the first time, if I'm looking back, where difficulty continued to scale slowly, and all of a sudden you were like, man, this is really hard now. And because like sometimes you play like Super Mario Brothers, the original even, and sometimes it just was always hard. It didn't always feel like it scaled in difficulty as you went. Whereas this game, you pass this board, okay, let's make it a little tougher, and so on and so forth. So I don't know how far I ever got it the furthest, but I feel like I got at the very least into the 30s or something like that before it would start to get like, all right, now this is hard.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of those games that I played a lot of the early levels, and then I was just like, yeah, that's all I need, really.
Yeah, I understand that, but I don't know. For whatever reason, I always wanted to see if I could I don't know if there's an end, but I would have loved to have found it.
Is there an end to Bubble Bobble?
Yeah, I'm curious. Does it just keep going, or I feel like there must be an end.
It does seem like there is an end. Need to get the crystal in 99, enter the secret door, and defeat the boss. That's the true ending.
The boss. Okay.
And there's a
All
bad
right.
ending apparently as well.
A bad ending. Ooh. This game
There's
is
the good
deep.
ending, the bad ending, and the true ending.
Oh,
Unlocked
man.
depending on how the player progresses through the game. Huh,
I might
okay.
have to throw this in the queue.
Well, we have learned something new.
We
yeah.
have. The more you
All right.
know. Number three, a game that I don't think you've heard much about. Super Mario Brothers 3.
Hey!
I had to throw that one in there. Again, fantastic game. I have a lot of great memories of. We've talked about this just a little bit in this episode, so I don't want to belabor the point, but I had to include this one. And I will say, kind of on the topic of like, do we include all the games from one series, or do we, maybe pick a highlight from the series and then go with that? That was how I decided to do this list. I wanted to just pick one from the series, because if I did that, I don't even know that Super Mario Brothers 3 would make it in my list. I would have to push things down. Number two, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3: The Manhattan Project.
Very good game. It was also an honorable mention on my side.
I love this. I adore this game. I mean, number one, it's got the Konami code in it, so there's that going for it. That was the first time I'd ever played a game that had this code: up, down, down, left, right, A, B, start, or B. It was A, B, or B, A. It depended on the game, and I want to say this was not the exact Konami code; it was the opposite. But I played this game out like crazy. I got it for my birthday. I kept the box from the game like into adulthood, into being a parent, and I sold it on eBay for $100. The box.
I remember you telling me this. I think this was 2022, because I was down in Florida on vacation with my parents, and you had told me that you were doing this.
Yeah, wasn't that recent even? I believe it, but no. But that game, I loved playing. I mean, when you're going down the beach, when you're on the surfboards, all the different bosses. It had like basically everyone you had a figure of or saw in the cartoon was in it. Ground Chuck, Dirtbag, Toka, Razor, all of them. Super Shredder at the end. Sorry, spoiler, my fault.
But not the Triceratons, which were on
not
the
the
box.
Triceratons who were on the cover of the box. That made no sense whatsoever. Still,
I did ask Konami about that when I wrote the history of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles video games. And they basically said it was based on like reference material that Eastman and Laird had sent over. And they were just like, oh, well, this is a cool looking enemy. Let's put them on the front. And they just didn't communicate with the people actually making the game. And it resulted in that.
Kind of like how my parents will ask me the same question twice because they didn't communicate when I answered the first time. That sometimes it's good to just talk. Then you get a better product. And
Yes.
But at any rate, neither here nor there. That game is still fantastic.
That was number two? Okay, so
yes,
number
that
one
was number
now.
two. Number one, Mega Man 3.
Ooh. I had
So
Mega
I'm
Man
a
2 on my
giant-
list, but I fell off.
I'm a giant Mega Man fan, and I just played literally every Mega Man game for my children recently because they got very into it. My son even wanted a Mega Man shirt, so he got one for his birthday. And we showed up to his birthday party, and the guy at the door was like, "Hey, great Mega Man shirt." I think he was a little surprised. But anyway, I had to just pick one Mega Man for this one. I probably would have been able to put in 2 and even 4, and that would have shifted things down. But I went with 3 here, which is a little controversial because everyone would say 2. I have better memories of 3 because that was the first time I ever experienced the series. So I went over to my friend's house, my buddy Ben. He had this game, and I was playing it there, and we played that one like probably for a whole year. You know, you just kept playing it and playing and playing it. Gemini Man, where you'd go in, and this game was, it's got a kind of a rough development history. It was kind of rushed, and apparently it left in certain things like you can hold the one of the buttons or a couple of the buttons on the other controller, and it's like a code, like a developer code, so you can jump in a pit, and then you can do like mega jumps, and it was all sorts of like wackiness about it. And I have so many fun memories of either breaking the game or even beating the game. So that one stands out for me. That number 3 is my number 1.
I had that experience with the Sonic games on Genesis because I had a Game Genie that I would just use to relentlessly break those games. And I had so
Mhm.
much fun with that. And also, I think it was a Game Shark that I had on my Game Boy Color for the Pokemon games where I would just like cheese the crap out of it and basically like be like, okay, well, I'm leaving Pallet Town and I have a team that is literally the exact same team that Ash has in the Pokemon anime, where it was like Pikachu, Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur, Pidgeotto, and the rotating final Pokemon, which I would usually choose Butterfree because that was like the first one in the anime. But yeah, I would do all that kind of stuff. So yeah, when you figure out that there is a way you can break one of these old games, it is so much fun. Especially if you've beaten the game like multiple times, and it's like, how can I get like more enjoyment out of this game? That is the way that we would do it back then. It wasn't like DLC or anything like that. It was we would find ways to absolutely shatter what the developers actually meant for us to experience this game.
Yeah, I don't think the Pokemon company is going to love this, but I definitely had, let's say, a few more rare candies than I was supposed to because of my
Yes.
Game Shark.
But then you had to make it so that the Pokemon would obey you past a certain level because if like you didn't have the right badges,
Well,
Pokemon
yeah,
beyond a
you'd
certain
wait.
yeah, so it was like a very like precarious way of being like, okay, can I break this game without completely destroying my save file? Was often like the balancing act you had to play.
Mostly, I don't want to sidetrack this because we're obviously talking about NES, but I would mostly wait until I'd at least gotten near the end of the game. And then I just wanted to have like level 100 Mewtwo and level 100 Dragonite. So then when I went against my friends and we would battle over the link cables, like I could crush them because I didn't want them to think that they were good.
Wow,
No,
you're ruthless in the playground.
deadly.
All right, so my top five is actually almost completely different from yours, even though you named off I think no fewer than actually four of yours were like honorable mentions for me, except I would have gone Mega Man 2 instead of 3, as you had
Fair.
mentioned. So I struggled with not putting Bubble Bobble or Mega Man 2, Manhattan Project, TMNT. Lots of those games would have been right at home. Blades of Steel, had I thought of it, might have been a contender for number five. My number five is Contra, another Konami game. And this was one of the earlier games that I remember playing. And just like, 2-player side scrolling, shoot 'em up, just a blast. I was so happy last year when Way Forward remade this game in Contra Operation Galuga. It definitely didn't capture all the charms of this NES game, but it was a lot of fun. And I still have very fond memories of playing Contra with my uncle back in the day. So that's my number five. Number four, I did not go the route that you went of having one representative from each franchise, but there's only 2 entries of this franchise on my list. Number four, I'm going to go Super Mario Brothers 2 USA.
Okay, all
And
right. And that's at least a very different game, so that's fair.
yeah, it's hard to say like, okay, well, this is just like the exact same continuation of this game. Doki Doki Panic or Super Mario USA is such a different experience from the rest of the Mario franchise, but it has a lot of fun things that were introduced into the franchise through that game. And I have just formative gaming memories of playing this and they're like, oh, this is Mario 2. And I was like, this doesn't look anything like Mario 1. Like, what are you talking about? Like, and then it's like, oh no, that is Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Princess, as she was known back then.
Princess.
It reminds me of what is that game? Uh, I remember going over to a friend's house, and they had and this was after the the arcade had received the God's blessing, which was Street Fighter 2, which is what my hoodie says. And I
Nice
was
hoodie.
like, oh man, Street Fighter 2 is awesome. And I never knew what Street Fighter 1 was. And I went over to a friend's house and they had this game called Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight on NES. And it's like a action game. And I was like, what the heck is this? And it turns out Capcom just basically rebranded one of its action games that it was working on to be a Street Fighter game to capitalize on the success of the franchise and like trying to make a franchise out of it. And I was like, I guess just games aren't like similar to their sequels. I was like, this must be Street Fighter 1 because it came out in 1990. And then no, it just turns out that was like a weird like attempt to shoehorn the brand into this.
I once found Street Fighter 1 at it was a mini golf course in Michigan where some of my cousins live. So we visited them occasionally, and I played it, and I was like, this game is terrible.
Yeah, there's a reason that it didn't take off, but Street Fighter 2 did.
Yes.
Speaking of franchises that had sequels that were very different from the original, number 3 for me, the original Legend of Zelda. This is
Okay.
one of the first video games I ever played, and it really, I mean, it's not my favorite Zelda game. I think that, Link to the Past really solidified a lot of the core tenets that the franchise would go to carry on to the subsequent entries, much in the way that Mario 3 did for the Mario franchise. But yeah, the original Legend of Zelda, just such kind of like a brain-breaking experience when I was a little kid, and I was just used to playing like these next two games or Mario 1 and then my number 2 game that I'm going to talk about in a second here. And I'm just like, okay, so this is what a video game is, or Duck Hunt, where it's like, okay, very small bite-sized experiences, very linear in how you do it, or very like focused in on what your objective is. Zelda is just like, hey, here's just a big world, like get this sword and go explore. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean just go explore? Like there's no like mission to go accomplish. And it's just like, no, that like really like changed my perspective on what a video game could be in a very early part of my gaming career. And then number 2, another very early game for me, and that was Tetris on the NES. And the reason I put this so highly is because I know that most people experience Tetris on their Game Boy. For me, it was playing it on the NES. So much so that like the song that they put from the Nutcracker in that soundtrack is burned into my brain and will never leave my brain, and will always be the way that I think of when like if I go to see like a live production, it could be like the greatest Russian ballet ever, and I go to see the Nutcracker. As soon as that song was a Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. As soon as that comes on, I will think of Tetris, because how closely I associate that song now with the NES version specifically. It's not in the Famicom version. It is only in the NES version, from my understanding of Tetris. But yeah, also, it's one of the most perfect video games ever created. So that's why it also gets up there.
All right, fair.
And number 1, if you haven't guessed it already, I have a lot of love for Super Mario Bros. 3. So we don't need to talk much more about that game in this episode. But Scott, before we wrap up, that brings us to the final segment. It is the eShop Gem of the Week, a chance for you to give some shine to a game that might not otherwise get shouted out on this podcast. What is your eShop Gem of the Week?
I'm going with one that it's more than a decade old at this point. SteamWorld Dig. Did you ever play that, by the way?
I didn't. My first experience with the SteamWorld franchise was actually just last year, playing SteamWorld Heist 2, which I was reviewing for Game Informer up until the point that Game Informer was shut down, in which case I said, oh, I guess I'm not playing video games for a little while, because I was not in the mood to.
Fair.
SteamWorld Heist 2 is very good. I've heard great things about a lot of the SteamWorld games.
So I'm not like, I haven't played like a ton of them, but it was always my understanding that they're different, right? A lot of them play quite differently. SteamWorld Dig, it takes place in kind of like an old west type of town, but everybody's robots. You are Rusty, who has to dig down underground and collect resources. Essentially, you're trying to unlock more things to do. It's a platformer at heart, but you're also it's a bit of I don't want to call it a collectathon. I don't think it's quite like that, but yeah, it's gathering resources, battling enemies along the way, with even bosses and that kind of thing. It was a very addicting experience when I played it a bunch of years back. And for whatever reason, I vibed with it very well. I highly recommend it to anybody who, number one, if you like this, like kind of the steampunk type aesthetic, I think that's pretty much up your alley. It's a pretty easy game to jump into. I don't think the degree of difficulty is too high on this particular game. It's a lot of fun. It's got a sequel as well, SteamWorld Dig 2. It takes place with a different character. But within the same world, same gameplay, that type of thing. But with some twists, some evolutions, not revolutions. But I highly recommend that series to anybody who might like a platformer with a kind of that aesthetic to it.
So it came out on 3DS back in 2013, and then it came to the Switch in 2018. But it's not the most recent platform that SteamWorld Dig came to. Can you guess the 2 most recent platforms that SteamWorld Dig came to? Hint, came to them in 2020.
Goodness. Let's go with the Ouya.
You're not far off. It's Amazon Luna and Stadia.
Oh, all right, okay.
I mean, you weren't far off by going the cloud streaming route because those are two cloud streaming platforms. But yes, it did come to the Switch in 2018, and it's normally $10. But Scott, get this: until February 12th, it's only $2 on the eShop.
$2. Find $2 in your couch or something like that. I'm sure you lost some change. Just dig it up.
Did they?
Literally dig it up and buy SteamWorld Dig.
Who has change in 2025?
I don't know. I've got some coins right here. I got your change right here, dude.
Well, mail that to whoever. Hit up Scott at on social media. He'll send you a quarter that will go towards 1/8 of your purchase of SteamWorld Dig.
I'm literally looking at like 75% of the money you need right now in coinage.
Well, that shows both of our ages because I also have a pocket in my car for coins in case I ever need coins. I don't know, like maybe I'm in a place where there's a parking meter that doesn't have like a mobile app or whatever. But I will say the parking meters in my town, if you use coins, you save money. You don't have to pay the fees, so it's actually cheaper. I don't even think I can put coins in my parking meters.
Well, that's because everything's frozen there. Everything is frozen in Minnesota.
That's true. Everything is just frozen solid. It's just the pay station is enclosed in a block of ice.
It's just like the ice world in Super Mario Brothers 3.
Perfect way to close out this episode. Thank you so much to everyone for listening. As you know, my Patreon and the associated Discord server are the best ways to get any questions or comments in. You can also get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com or hit me up on Blue Sky or Instagram at Brian P. Shea. That is also my YouTube channel name, and if you would subscribe to my channel, it would help me out a lot. Scott, tell everyone what you have to plug and where they can find you online.
I'm kind of just doing the MMA media coverage that I've been doing for many years, as which was basically what brought you and I together, Brian. Our love and appreciation for this wacky sport, this kooky sport. You can find my coverage of that for the New York Post at nypost.com/MMA. I do generally weekly interviews. We actually are debuting a new podcast soon, so keep an eye out for that as well. I'm on social media at Scott_Fontana on Twitter. If you still don't hate that app enough to leave it, which you should leave it, just like Brian did. That's the right way to go. I'm also on Blue Sky, so you can find me there.
That is our show for this week. Thank you again for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time. Before we wrap up this episode of the All Things Nintendo podcast, I want to give a special shout out to the $10 patrons to the show. Abdullah, Adam Scott, Alex Stadnick, Andy Junkins, Ben Richland, Chaps My Ass, Derek Sigmund, Dusty Beeman, Ian T. Clark, Jackal, Jason Thompson, Jawar Hello, Jill Grote, Johnny Five, Jordan Sloat, Jose Villalobos, Joshua DeProy, Cody Gibson, Creeper 207, Mad Genie Confused Koala, Megan S., Pratable, Rob McCann, Bobby Mac 265, Robert Sosa, Russell Sayer, Smithy Poo, Tux DC, Wham Bam Sam the Gaming Man, Zach Marcus, Zachary Pliggy, and Zek 3 Sword Sama. Thank you so much for your continued support of this podcast.
Every hero strikes out on their adventure for a different reason.
To prove myself worthy of my mother's praise.
To write my own story and discover who I really am.
To prove to my family that I am more than they believe me to be.
To revive the god that has chosen me.
But when the fragile balance of the world is in jeopardy, and sinister forces move in the darkness, heroes will be tested, pushed to their limits and beyond. And it will be left to them to determine if they are up to the task. There is a darkness rising. Will they be able to overcome the challenges and meet this evil head-on?
For my god.
For my story.
For my freedom.
For the world.
To restore the balance. Modified Role Season 2, The Chronicles of Erin, a D&D 5e actual play podcast. New season, new characters, new story. Find us on all the usual podcasting apps or at modifiedrole.com.